Hello, I'm Douglas Brinkley, presidential historian for the New York Historical Society. I'm here to have a conversation about our 43rd president, George W. Bush, with the New York Times chief White House correspondent, Peter Baker. I'm here from the Robert H. Smith Auditorium at the New York Historical Society. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
George W. Bush, if you imagine 100 years from now, people looking back at his presidency, 8 years as commander-in-chief of our nation, what do you think are the things people are going to remember about his tenure?
I think George W. Bush is going to be an important figure in history because he serves at a juncture in our history, right? When we moved from our sort of quiescent post-Cold War, perhaps self-delusional view that everything was going to be great in the end of history, suddenly we faced a whole new world of threats and danger and turmoil and change. How he responded to that, of course, will be the ultimate historical debate. He obviously had 9/11 to deal with, mostly praised for his response to that ultimately, but then decides to take the country into the war in Iraq, which doesn't work out anywhere the way he or his people had projected. So I think that's going to be one of these great historical debates that's not going to be resolved, certainly in the near future. Maybe by 100 years from now, smarter historians than I am, but maybe as smart as you, will tell us what to think.
Well, our whole country mourned the death of George Herbert Walker Bush, 41.
Yeah.
And Bush 43, his son, gave such a moving eulogy in Washington, D.C. about him. What was the core of the relationship between father and son? And people go back to John Quincy Adams,
right,
and now the two Bushes. What is their relationship like?
Look, he loved his father, okay? We should start with that, and I think his father loved him. It was a complicated relationship. John Quincy Adams became president, but his father died during his presidency. His father did not come to Washington for his inauguration. He never was part of John Quincy Adams' administration. We never had, therefore, a father-son presidency like we had with George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. George H.W. Bush called him Quincy. George W. Bush is the one who came up with the 41, 43. As a boy, George W. Bush, of course, lived in the shadow of a great man. His father had gone to war at age 19, shot down over the Pacific, a war hero. He was the star baseball player at Yale, successful at everything he seemed to do. He went to Texas to make a fortune of his own and came up with oil wells that all, more or less worked out. George W. Bush doesn't go to war, serves in the Air National Guard. He is not able to make the Yale baseball team. He becomes a cheerleader. Right? He taps all these wells in Texas and all of his come up dry, right? And he's sort of a ne'er-do-well for the first 4 decades of his life. It's till he's age 40 till he finally quits drinking, when he really begins to turn things around. And he helps his father on the 1988 campaign, and Laura Bush later says if there was ever any competition between the two, that's when it finally ended, that finally George W. finds his place in his father's orbit and begins this new part of his life.
Well, when John Kerry got 3 Purple Hearts, Silver Star, Bronze Star in Vietnam, but one reporter once jokingly said to me, he got shrapnel, little bits of shrapnel in him, and Bush's hangovers were more serious than Kerry's war injuries. I mentioned that to just, what was the alcohol story with George W. Bush?
He did have this sort of, roguish quality to him, right? It later became politically a benefit, but in his youth it wasn't. He was a drinker. He's never admitted to being an alcoholic per se, didn't use that term, but in effect acknowledges the same sort of struggle. Ultimately, he turns it around. Laura is part of it. The line is, she said, it's either Jim Beam or me. Now she denies she ever actually said that, but that was the quality of her message to to George W. Bush. You need to knock it off. He had a religious awakening in a way, fostered in part by Billy Graham, who took him on a walk at Kennebunkport on the beach. They talked about religion and faith. And I think at some point he realized that he had to get his act together or he was going to embarrass his father. He did not want, his father was getting ready to run. He did not want to make his father's life more difficult by being a screw-up. And one day when he was 40 years old, he celebrated his 40th birthday at the Broadmoor in Colorado. They had so many bottles of Silver Oak wine, and Laura says that they were telling the same stories again and again, and each time they got funnier and funnier to the people who were drinking, but not to everybody else. And he woke up the next morning and goes for a run, and he's like halfway through the run before he realizes he can't shake this feeling he was having of the alcohol that was still in his system. And that was the day he decided to quit, and he quit cold turkey. And it's this discipline that he brings to that, actually, that is one of his strengths, right? He manages through discipline to become a more successful person. He ultimately becomes the part owner of the Texas Rangers and wins the governorship of Texas twice, and obviously the White House, not just once as his father did, but a second time.
Do you think he was a born-again Christian the way Jimmy Carter was, had a conversion experience?
He uses that phrase, and in fact, he did talk about his religion when he ran for president in 2000. In one of the debates, they were asked one of these, smart-ass reporter questions like, who is your most influential figure that you admire the most? And most of them would say Ronald Reagan or maybe Thomas Jefferson or something like that. And he said Jesus. And it was kind of a little off because you don't hear that much in a political debate. And his dad said to him afterwards, "I think you did really well, and don't worry about that Jesus thing. You'll recover from that," thinking it was a mistake, right? And George W. said, "I didn't think that was a mistake. That's who I am." He came to realize that religiosity could be a turnoff, and he kind of, I think, held back. Jimmy Carter, his religiosity was both an attraction as well as a cautionary tale for a lot of voters.
And George W. Bush loves Texas. Not only does he live in Dallas now, not only was he a two-term governor. Do you think of him as Texas populist in creating this new populist movement we see in the right today? Or
in a way, he was trying to redefine the right. Remember, this is the 90s when Gingrich was the singular focus of the new Republican Party. And in Bush's mind, George W. Bush's mind, Gingrich represented a harsh coloration of the party. He was if you'll pardon the Grinchy version of republicanism, and he wanted to be the compassionate Christian conservative version of it. So he picked 4 issues, and he was remarkably disciplined on it. Juvenile justice, tax cuts, welfare reform, and
teacher's salary. I think he got behind
education. I think education. Exactly. So he was trying to reorient the Republican Party away from its image of being a harder-edged party. So when, in fact, he runs for president in 2000 as the governor of Texas, Gingrich has some budget bill that involves some cutting of some social programs, and he comes out and says, "I don't think we should balance our budget on the back of poor people." And that's a symbol, that's a signal to the country that he wants to be a different kind of Republican.
Compassionate conservative.
Conservative, but compassionate. In other words, liberal goals, but conservative means to those goals, right? In other words, if liberals had cornered the market on the idea that they cared about people, but they did it through big government, that would be the oversimplistic version of things. He wanted to say, look, Republicans can care about people too. We just need to find other small government, versions of helping people through tax incentives, through encouraging entrepreneurship, and so on and so forth.
2000, the presidential election, we'll all remember the dangling chads and the Supreme Court outcome. What did George W. Bush do right in your mind in that campaign?
It's interesting because think about what George W. Bush, he comes just 8 years after his father lost, right? His father lost big. Here, 8 years later, his son comes along and convinces the country, let's give the Bushes another try. So one thing he did right was forming his own identity, even though he was capitalizing on his father's name. Right, he managed that tricky balance between, dynasty and freshness. That he did right, and I think he managed to position the Republican Party, as I said, away from at least some of the harsher edges that it had come to take on. And when the election in Florida came down to the recount, the most important thing he did was make James Baker the guy in charge, because I think James Baker, his father, Secretary of State, understood how to go to war in Florida and win that recount. And that's, I talked to Democrats who said the second they learned that James Baker was in charge, they knew they were in real trouble. And that was probably the smartest thing he did.
What is the relationship? What was it like between Bush 43 and Dick Cheney?
Yeah.
And what is it like now?
At the time, Cheney was going to be the grown-up on the ticket to school the governor who didn't know anything about foreign policy and on serious things. And Cheney has a lot of influence in the early days of the Bush administration because Bush wants him to. He has Bush's imprimatur to do the things he does for the most part. And he's pushing on an open door. The things that Cheney is advocating are things that Bush agrees with. Bush is more conservative than his father. But the relationship changes, actually. After the Iraq War goes bad, after the re-election in the second term, Cheney really begins to get pushed off to the side a little bit. Bush elevates Condi Rice to Secretary of State. She really becomes his most important advisor at that point. He and Cheney are increasingly disagreeing on a lot of things, on Iran, on Iraq, on how to handle Russia, on North Korea, on Syria, on climate change, on gun rights, on a lot of things. They are increasingly at odds over that second term. And it ends 8 years later with this extraordinary fight in the Oval Office where Cheney is trying to get Bush to pardon Scooter Libby. Scooter Libby had been his chief of staff, had been convicted in the CIA leak case, not of the leak, in fairness to Libby, but of lying about it, which he says he didn't do, but he was convicted of that. Bush had commuted his sentence, so he didn't have to actually go to jail, but he refused to pardon him because he thought that he should respect the verdict of the jury and not overturn it. Cheney comes in the last days and says, this is one of our guys. He's been railroaded. They went after him because they were trying to have to go after me. You should pardon him. And Bush refuses. And Cheney says to him, you've left a good man on the field of battle. And that's this big breaking point between them. And so their relationship today, I think, is very distant. And they're not like good friends.
Many Democrats thought Al Gore won the election because he had won the popular vote. And they didn't really accept George W. Bush pre-9/11. Did Bush feel that way? Was he feeling that people were acting like he shouldn't have won? He was like a fake president. Did that bother him at all?
We forget about that, right? Isn't that interesting? Had it not been for 9/11 in Iraq, the fundamental story of the Bush presidency would have been a guy who didn't win the popular vote, and his efforts to translate his victory anyway into a presidency that's considered legitimate. I don't think he ever decided to let that bother him. He charged forward as if he had a mandate. Their theory was, if you act like a mandate, you have a mandate. And so he pushed forward with his tax cuts, even though he hadn't won the popular vote. He did work with Democrats early on some things. Teddy Kennedy came in, and the two of them got together on education reform, No Child Left Behind. That was an important bipartisan measure that's almost impossible to think of today. But Bush decided he wasn't going to act like an illegitimate president because he didn't think he was an illegitimate president. And you're right, 9/11 comes along, and then that whole issue goes away because there are bigger things to talk about.
Now, on that day, 9/11, 8 months into his presidency, he was in Florida, Sarasota, did his morning jog, and then was headed and went to a public school and ended up famously reading My Pet Goat with Andrew Card whispering in his ear. They're finding out what's going on with the World Trade Towers and the Pentagon. Bring us back to that moment. What did Bush do when he found out about the news of 9/11? What was the next few weeks like for him?
As you mentioned, Andy Card comes out and whispers in his ear and says, a second tower has been hit. America is under attack. Whispers this in his ear, and Bush has this look on his face like, And he doesn't leave, right? He doesn't get up and walk off and say, holy moly, we're under attack, I gotta do something about it. He sits there for another 5-6 minutes, which in hindsight, as you watch this, feels very painful knowing what's going on. But he didn't want to disrupt the class, and his mind was clearly sort of trying to process this unthinkable thing that had just happened to the country. And so I have some sympathy for what that must be like, but it always became a mocking point for him and didn't project the sort of urgency of the moment. And then they whisk him off to Air Force One because they don't know what's going on. They've now been hit in New York, in Washington, and there's a fourth plane that's on the way, that maybe to the Capitol, maybe the White House. They misinterpret some intelligence and think that the Air Force One itself is going to be targeted. They put him on the plane up in the air, 40,000 feet, as fast as you can, with warplanes on either side. The reporters who were on the plane that day, my friends, say they looked out the window of Air Force One and they could see fighter jets on their wing, which they had never seen before. They don't bring him back to Washington because they're afraid of what's going on. They bring him first to Louisiana and then to Oklahoma. And he's restless and he's like, I've got to get back. He knows this is bad for the country if a president looks like he's fleeing danger, and finally forces them to go back to Washington. He gives a speech. It was not the best speech. One of his speechwriters later called the Awful Office speech rather than the Oval Office speech. But over the next few days, he found his footing. He began to sort of rise to the occasion, and he rallies an international coalition. We debate today whether Afghanistan war is worth it or not, but at the time, nobody debated it. That was an obvious thing to do because that's where al-Qaeda had been. Only later would we sit there and realize, well, maybe we didn't do it right, or maybe it's a quagmire that we need to find our way out of. But at the time, there was this world solidarity.
Now we could say he becomes almost a wartime president now after 9/11. What was his thinking about going into Afghanistan and then the extension of the war into Iraq, and this idea of there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and the fact to have a second war in Iraq, his father doing the first Gulf War in '91, and now there's a second. Take us through some of the foreign policy thinking of Bush 43.
I think what we forget is the mood that was in the country and in the White House in that time. We can all have our thoughts about whether we should have gone into Iraq. I think it looks a lot clearer to us today. Clearly, the intelligence on the weapons was wrong. Even people around him think he would have made a different decision had he known that. But in the White House was this period of great fear and anxiety, and some of which we saw at the time, some of which we didn't. They had a botulinum scare one time where they thought that the detectors in the White House had detected what they thought was this killer disease that had infected the President of the United States. They arrested these Pakistani nuclear scientists who had supposedly been consulting with Osama bin Laden about how to build a bomb. I mean, every single day, the president was getting what they call the threat matrix, which listed dozens of ways bad people were trying to kill Americans that day. Now, sir, Mr. President, it's your job to stop them all. Now, that affects your thinking. Think about what that's like every day. You're the commander-in-chief, and every day here are 15 new plots, and people are trying to get us. This is what's in their heads in the White House in the fall of 2001 and the beginning of 2002 when they begin this march to Iraq. Now, did Iraq have anything to do with 9/11? Of course it didn't. Did Iraq have weapons of mass destruction? No, they didn't. A lot of people believe that they did. And I think he just had this idea that he was going to take on threats, and Iraq was a threat. He knew it was a threat because his father had dealt with it. It hadn't been resolved, and he was going to finish that.
There was people playing on his cowboy boots in the ranch in Crawford. There was sort of a cowboy diplomacy.
Yeah.
Became a phrase, and wanted dead or alive, Osama bin Laden. What about all that, this sort of cowboy, I'm going to get the bad guy? Was that part of his persona?
It's part of his persona, it's part of his personality, it's part of his political identity. It was Laura Bush who would kind of rein him in, Oh, what are you going to do, Bush? You going to get him? She would tease him, and he would kind of realize, okay, I'm maybe gone a little too overboard. So he learned. I mean, he did change over time. I mean, people don't give presidents credit, I think, for evolving, but they do. And the early, chest thumping kind of stuff begins to fall away, especially as the war starts to go bad. He's the guy who's meeting with the families of people whose sons and daughters have been hurt or killed, and it wears on him just as it would any president.
Yeah, it seems even now as ex-president, it's dissipated. And the point that, his love of our troops and the sadness that Americans died on his watch, and the work he does for the Wounded Warriors groups and U.S. veterans of the Iraq War, and he does the paintings of them with number 43 signed and paints our men and women. I think it's touched the American public, that side of it.
I think that's genuine. Now, the psychobabble journalist in me would say, okay, what's he trying to do? Is he expunging some feelings of guilt or responsibility or what have you? He won't tell us. He doesn't like to talk about these things. He will never get me on the couch, he likes to say. But for whatever reason, he is truly dedicated to it in a personal way, as you say. These people, he knows them. He brings them to his ranch. He knows their stories. He told their stories in the book, as you say, of portraits he has painted of them.
The phrase we've talked about with Bush, compassionate conservative, it does show itself in a couple ways in his presidency, most famously with the work he did in AIDS in Africa. Where does that emanate from, and what was the policy and the public health concern he was addressing?
Yeah, so at the time, AIDS was just ravishing Africa, and they just didn't have a handle on it. And he wanted to do something big. He wanted to do something impactful. that would really make a difference. And he asked for more money than anybody ever would have expected, particularly a Republican president, but probably any president, to spend on Africa. These days, when we're all about America first, this is a genuine act of American charity and compassion toward another part of the world. You know, so much of his presidency was about death and darkness and threats and anger, and that this was something he could do that was positive.
And he had interesting immigration, policies, and he had a long history of dealing with the U.S.-Mexico border as a Texas governor and then as president. What do you see as the differences between George W. Bush, conservative Republicans' view of the U.S.-Mexican border versus the way Trump views it?
Yeah, well, he's very differently. I mean, and it's one of these, you'll never know counterfactuals, but had he managed to get the immigration reform plan that he wanted to get through on a bipartisan basis through in 2006 or 2007, imagine how different our country would be today. But he used to say, family values don't stop at the Rio Grande. That we should look at people who come across the border legally or illegally as human beings, and that we have to enforce our laws and we have to protect the border, but that we ought not to vilify them or demonize them. He felt very strongly about that. And so his prescription was secure the border and find a path to legalization for most of the people who are here illegally. He thought these things had to go together. He signed the Secure Fence Act of 2006. That's the wall you currently see on the border was built by George W. Bush and the Democrats who voted for it, about 650 miles worth of fencing and other kinds of barriers. What you see now is sort of an exaggerated form of that debate. Bush believed, let's do barriers where they make sense. We don't have to do the entire border. And we will package this with, an overhaul of our immigration laws so that they make more sense in his view and resolve the problem of the 11 million people who are already here. And he came close. He came very, very close. He had Republicans on his side, and he had Democrats who were going along with it, and it just fell apart in the Senate. And I was with him in Rhode Island the day it fell apart, and I don't think I'd ever seen him look so crestfallen at a political setback. He was very upset about it.
So he wins the second term. Now he's going to be a two-term president, but he hits a lot of snags along the way here. How could George W. Bush been more effective in responding to Hurricane Katrina?
Yeah. The first day of Katrina, people thought that the hurricane had kind of bypassed the city, and he didn't rush back to Washington. He decided he would go back to Crawford first and spend the night, and then go back to Washington. And I was with him on Air Force One when he flies over the city. Worst photo op in the history of the world, right? He flies over New Orleans, and the pictures of him looking out the plane, and of course, images, he's above it all. He's not there with the people. He's somehow, removed from this terrible disaster, and all the problems that the federal government then had were because of his either ineffectiveness or lack of caring. And I have to say, this is how you get in the bubble. I thought flying over New Orleans made sense as a reporter sitting on the plane that day. And I thought it was because he had three choices. One, you fly back to Washington straight. You don't even bother to go look. Two is you try to land there, and you get in the way of the disaster relief efforts, which is terrible. Or three, you at least make some pass and get some sense of it. And watching from the plane, let me tell you, I got a real sense of how horrific this catastrophe was for New Orleans and the whole Mississippi coast. It was extraordinary to see it. But as a matter of politics, as a matter of presidential leadership, it was a terrible decision. And some people actually warned him against it. But I think his heart was in the right place. People don't know that he went back 17 times after Katrina to New Orleans. And obviously he put about $100 billion worth of federal money into it. He understood that it was a mistake. He understood that it was a cock-up by his government on his watch. Whatever responsibility he personally had for it, he was going to take ownership of it. And he tried to make up for it. Part of the story of Bush is the screw-ups and the recoveries, his mistakes he makes, and then the efforts to try to fix them.
This is a question about politics in the Republican Party of today under Donald Trump. Can they go back to more values-oriented presidency of Ronald Reagan and the Bushes?
I think politics and history work in cycles. I think we're in a particular cycle right now, and that this too will come and go. I mean, remember when Reagan comes in, It was a devastating moment in the Republican Party history up until that point, and certainly for the country as well. We'd had Vietnam, Watergate, we had had the misery index and the oil, the gas lines and the Iran hostage crisis, and it felt like the country just couldn't succeed. And 8, 12 years later, there we were, the last superpower in the world standing. I have a feeling that the next president, whoever he or she is, Democrat or Republican, will likely feel the need to distinguish themselves from the current president. Well, part of that's just natural, by the way. David Axelrod, who of course is President Obama's senior advisor, says we tend to look for a remedy, not a replica of the last president. And so, in fact, when we picked George W. Bush, we picked him partly because he wasn't Bill Clinton. And we picked Barack Obama, we picked him partly because he wasn't George W. Bush. And certainly there's nobody less like Barack Obama than Donald J. Trump. So I think that the next president will want to show his or her differences. And I think, I think our institutions are strong.
Let's end on that note. Peter, thank you so much. Isn't he incredible? You're very lucky.